Hello and welcome to BlackStory. This is episode 2, Microaggressions. We're going to talk about this term, and we have some wonderful guests and a co-host with me this evening, today. And just to give a little context, back in the 1970s, Charles Pierce from Harvard wrote about microaggressions, and he said that they are incessant and cumulative. These can be based on implicit biases, and they can be either deliberate or unintentional. And then later in 2010, I believe, it was Durald Wing Su from Columbia who really expanded the definition to include not only race, but gender, orientation, disability. Um, so I'm really happy to have a co-host today, and I want to welcome my co-host, who is Tim Wortham Jr., and Tim is the Senior Director of Alumni and Family Philanthropic Engagement at Eastern University. Tim, thank you so much for deciding to join and for your input and your leadership in this topic. I really appreciate you being with me today.
It's my pleasure, Santo. Thank you for having me.
Sure. So we've got some great guests. Please introduce them and we'll get started with our conversation.
Absolutely. So today I'm very pleased to be able to present to you Lizza Robb, who's an MSW partner at Redshift Leadership, a Philadelphia-based organizational consulting firm. So welcome, Lizza.
Hi,
And
thanks.
we also have Tychelle M. She's also an MSW. She's a student affairs professional. She's a clinical social worker and a diversity educator. So welcome to you, Tychelle.
Thank you.
So we really want to jump right into our questions. And I want to start with you, Tychelle, and ask, how do you understand the term microaggression?
So as Santo was describing it, that's kind of where and really these commonplace, often unintentional, slights that happen. Sometimes they are intentional. So as we look at them, they're more like the intentional being like a Confederate flag or a swastika. That is not necessarily damaging physically, but it is a sign. Or there are these micro assaults and, someone serving someone before someone else. I think we usually know them as, the perpetual foreigner. So calling an Asian person or asking where an Asian person is from. But then we also have things like, people say things to me like, I got a lot when I was in grad school at Penn, you speak really well, right? So it was this denigrating, putting me outside of a certain group or into a certain group. So that's kind of how I navigate what microaggressions are, really a framework for these micro or micro insults or assaults that are commonplace that people don't often know are problematic.
I would just, underscore one thing you said, Tychelle, which is they're often unintentional. And what they do is like they reinforce inferiority based on someone's membership in a marginalized group. And so I think one that often happens also is, calling a Black person by the name of a different Black person, for instance.
I think one thing to add to that I do in working through microaggressions is that it creates this catch-22. Did this really happen to me? How can I address it? And it also gives the person who committed the microaggression a way to not be able to have a conversation about it. It creates a lot of, for the person who committed the microaggression, it creates a lot of anxiety, right? Because often they don't know it happened. So but for people of color or for that marginalized or underrepresented group, it kind of can create, depression and even like group ousting. So they won't be a part of a larger group. So say you're at work and you have white colleagues, when microaggressions happen, you're not necessarily going to go to those people, especially if you've tried and you can't have a conversation with them.
Such a good point. I heard an interview with Ibram Kendi recently where I think it was with Brene Brown, and she asked him, in your history, how many times have you given feedback to a white person, about microaggressions or anything? and he and had it go well, and he said zero. So around microaggressions, that feels like the important message for white people is like, don't be that white person. You know what I mean?
And Lizza, I have to ask, having said that, how would you explain microaggressions to white people who don't believe they exist or feel like Black, Indigenous, and people of color are simply being hypersensitive?
I've had that conversation a lot. It happens in the organizational context frequently, especially right now. I think people of color are rising up and sharing their stories collectively, so that the message, you can't ignore the message. And it's really tempting for white people, I think, for us to be defensive. Well, I didn't mean that. It wasn't my intention. We get away with a lot with the "it wasn't my intention" argument. And one of the things that I really try to reinforce with my clients broadly, any client who holds any kind of power in a situation, whether it's positional power or, you know, because you're in a white dominant group power, what I would say is your impact matters much more than your intent. Period. And, you know, part of the defensiveness, I think, is that analogy that, like, you know, as a white person, it's like you're swimming in water and it's really hard to look around and recognize, oh, this is water. And I think for that reason, explaining it to someone who doesn't believe in microaggressions or thinks, you know, people of color being hypersensitive, as you said, it's not necessarily a cognitive explanation. You know, I think it really depends on the individual. Like if it's a person who's, okay, if it's a person who's very analytical, maybe you share research, right? Tychelle already referenced a study about just the damaging impact of microaggressions. There are tons of stories about, you know, like Black teenagers in the US face multiple microaggressions online every day, and it's directly correlated with increased depression. But if somebody's more motivated by emotion, then, you know, they're probably going to need to hear from the mouths of people of color stories about what the experience is like for them. And there are lots of videos online. This isn't like, I would suggest, you know, lining people of color up and having them share their stories. Like, there are resources out there for us, right? There are videos, there are incredible collections of stories. So people, you know, it's a hearts and minds thing.
That puts on a lot of pressure a lot of times for Black people of color, particularly, which kind of leads us to our next question for Tychelle. So how do Black people of color navigate the presumption that they need to be the educator around issues of racial insensitivity, like the microaggressions we're talking about, and the education and that that a lot of white folks need to get?
So I would say, I mean, honestly, it depends on the person, right? Black people are not a monolith, so they're not all going to answer the same way, right? I'm gonna use myself as an example. Sometimes I'm ready to have the conversation. Sometimes I have time to have the conversation. Sometimes I'm open to have the conversation. But I get it, for me, it's sometimes hard when I'm educating a person who makes way more money than me, has way more power than me, because I'm spending my own time in, you know, we live in America, time is money. I'm spending my time educating white people about things that they've never had to think about to help them do what? Advance? Like, sometimes it's really easy, right? Sometimes you want to have a conversation because you know this person, you like this person, or this person, you know, generally has good intention. A lot of the work that I do with allies is telling them, you have to look inward. You have to go to your dinner table when the places that you don't want to make uncomfortable are the places you need to be making uncomfortable, right? You can't go to a protest and never talk to your family about racism, right? It's not necessarily helpful. It's more performative. It's more outward, right? So you need to be able to have that, because we sit in this discomfort every day. So you need to sit in this discomfort with your uncle, your aunt, your mom, your dad, your brothers and sisters. And Gen Z's doing that a lot better than a lot of us. and probably amid the pandemic in general, but we need to be able to have those conversations. And then we can't always be your educator, because if we knew how to end racism completely by ourselves, we would have done it, right? Like we wouldn't be sitting here needing to have this conversation even. So it is white people's work. And sometimes telling them that. I'm teaching a class right now on anti-racism. And I always say, I start my lecture, because we're co-teaching, with, I'm not here to make you feel better, but I'm also here to let you know that don't let your guilt arrest you, right? Like, because that's also not helpful. It's not going to help you. It's going to make you, it's going to stagnate you. So both and, but also thinking about decentering the whiteness that they experience, or the whiteness in their lives, and being able to educate themselves inside and outside of circles with Black folks.
In my experience, I think an inability to be in discomfort is one of the biggest obstacles to really anything, but really to this conversation, having a real connection and healing around microaggressions.
I'm co-teaching a class, like I was saying, on it's a 14-week class, and one of the instructors was making a statement about something racist that her father had said, something that had a racial undertone. And she started with, he's a good person, right? You always have to name how white people are good, right? Because Christianity teaches white people to be good people. So if you do anything against what your good people is, then you have to name it outside so it can fall back upon you as a person. You have to be like, I'm a good person, or he's a good person, or we don't know his heart, right? I had a supervisor, short story. I had a supervisor, I was wearing a head wrap, put both his hands on my head and say, oh, I love this, right? And I'm at work, and it's not my boss, it's my boss's boss's boss, right? And I was frozen. What do I do? What do I say? And I've had it happen to me countless times, at least 5 times in the last 3 years. And I was arrested. I was like, I don't know what to do, right? But I saw a young Black girl look at me with I knew I couldn't just be quiet, be silent because of my own discomfort. I had to say something for her, because if I don't say something, then I'm telling her that this is okay to happen to her. Yeah. I'm an educator by trade, so I know that sometimes you plant seeds and never see flowers. So I had the conversation and left it at that. And then I went back to that young girl and said, I did talk to him, just so you know, because it's not okay. I want you to have a voice.
It would seem like you're repeating the same thing over and over, just the cast of character changes.
So with that being said, how does an authentically motivated person of privilege go about learning and finding accurate information if they can't have like these awkward and clumsy interactions with people of color?
It's really about the education and the discomfort, right? So once you start seeking out the education, you have to sit in the discomfort. You can't hear about something and then want to fix it. Like that does not work. Like, okay, climate change is an issue. Okay, how do we fix the environment? Okay, well, I have to learn why it's an issue and what caused it and what I need to put back into the environment and how to do it. And I have to sit with all of these things and knowing them. So it's the conversation, it's the discomfort, it's the seeking out education, but it's also really about your own position and trying not to be defensive. I had a friend I have a friend, and that's why he is a friend. He said he went to a conference and he asked, what can I do? And a Black woman said, sit at the foot of a Black woman and listen. And he was like, oh, I will do that. And I can call him on his stuff and say, really? I call him on first world things and microaggressive things and, homophobic things, like being able to have those conversations. So they will be awkward. They will be clumsy. Know that, sit in that, understand that, and don't shy away from it. Say thank you when someone says, say thank you. I didn't know that. I'm going to look into that. And then really have a conversation with a white person if you feel emotional about it, because a lot of what happens is, for our framework, white women are the most protected group, right? Everybody wants to protect white women, right? So if we're having that conversation, especially for me, because I'm having lots of conversations with white women, don't start crying and now I'm aggressive and you're the victim, right? Don't flip that switch. You really need to go process that after we've had the conversation and you say thank you and we have it and we're okay, process it, and then come back to me and say, you know, I really thought about that. I talked to my friend about it and I was really wondering, right? You know, decolonize your bookshelf, read Black authors, right? Read the experiences because we've put them down, right? I also, I think Daniel Kaluuya, who was in Black Panther and Get Out, said, Black excellence is a product of Black oppression, right? We've put it on film, we've put it in the music, we've put it everywhere. You can read it, but not reading it from a lens of, oh, that's so sad for them, right? Reading it with the lens of the academics. There are academics who put out that work. So it's there for people to be able to read and understand, not enjoy, but read and understand and learn from.
I feel like Tychelle's got it. Like, I don't need to come back in and like repeat what she said. So I just want to name that, because I actually had one of my very dearest friends, Black woman, gave me feedback years ago about an overt microaggression where we were in a meeting and I said something that another white woman had said, and later she said, did you hear that I actually said that first? And then she said it, and then you like sort of lauded her for her contribution. And I was like, dang, did I?
I get that a lot from white men, where we'll have conversations and then they'll summate at the end. That happens so often. And I'm thinking about a time it happened to me, and I had to pull that person aside and say, you know, you don't have to summate all of what everyone has said, right? You don't need to say, I mean, it is very therapist, right, to say what I hear you saying is, but it's not a one back and forth conversation. In a group, we don't always need to say, you know, you can agree, you can know what that person says, but I often hear that where they're summating and I'm like, no, what I said is the way I said it is exactly how I wanted to say it. And I've had to do that before, but it can be detrimental in work as well.
What does it do for the person on that end? How does it land?
It takes the mantle of what I've said away from me, right? But for me, it does. What it feels like is, oh, what that person is saying is going to be more important, or they think what they're saying is more important than what I even have to say, or it discredits. It's that it creates imposter syndrome. I experienced imposter syndrome in grad school, right? I didn't, and I say this to this day, I didn't buy anything my first semester at UPenn. I did not buy a thing. I was like, maybe they made a mistake and I'm not getting these grades. I'm not sure.
Maybe people watching who aren't familiar with the imposter syndrome. And I just wanted to just add a quick note about that, you know, and any of us can experience this, where you feel like you're a fraud, that you don't really belong here, you shouldn't be here. What are you doing staying up in front of the class? For me, you know, what do you think you can teach somebody about this? Who are you? You don't know anymore, blah, blah, blah. So I just wanted to add that, if that was helpful for folks who may not have known about that.
So I moved to Philadelphia from Georgia for college in 1994, and I was completely clueless. I really thought like color blindness was what we were working towards. And I was really fortunate in college to develop some authentically deep friendships with people of color who were patient and kind enough to help me understand that their experience was really different from mine and how much I didn't know. And so, you know, I think at that point as a white person, once I understood that I have a choice, I can easily remain complacent and kind of perpetuate that distance, perpetuate racism, or start doing some work and try to combat racism, both internalized, both personal and external. There are a lot of trainings out there specifically for white people where we can go and cry and do our work, and we don't need to be witnessed by or put our sort of the emotional labor and burden on people of color to educate us. So I would say definitely take advantage of those. I think the best advice I would have for a white person who really wants to show up for people of color is to like prepare, like know in advance how you're going to respond when someone comes to you and says, you know, hey, when this happened, you know, it really hurt me, or hey, you did this thing and it feels like a microaggression. Like there's nothing wrong with preparing. and knowing that how you want to be in that moment. And everything we do, like nothing is neutral. Everything we do is going to have an impact. So what impact do you want to have? And Tychelle talked about like wanting the conversation to be over really fast, right? Like the guy you spoke with is like, yeah, I got it. Like we can't do that. We have to be willing to like cross the bridge into someone else's world and say, how did that feel? Help me understand what that did to you.
Just listening to Lizza's journey and her own path to enlightenment, I wanted to know from you, do you feel differently when there is no assumption of responsibility on you as like this subject matter expert, so to speak, but rather the white person of privilege comes to you really seeking guidance or help and is not just putting that weight on you, but asking you for assistance?
It depends on my friendship, right? Like it depends on my time. It honestly, I've had some of these conversations. Sometimes I say, girl, I don't know. Like that's just, sometimes I don't know. It depends on what we're asking from, because I think some of the work that I do, I have, time and space to educate white folks, but I also have to educate Black folks in how to dismantle white supremacy in their own lives. And that's an entirely different work, right? We were born in this country and bred in this country to the myth of meritocracy, right? That's why we go to these schools, right? We buy into it as well. I remember going to Penn being like, I want to play tennis. And then I was like, do I want to play tennis because it's like a fancy white sport, or because I really like tennis? Like, what is my motivation for doing that? So really trying to spend some of that time there and balance that time, because if I am only educating white people and that's the basis of what I do, is there money in it? Maybe, but am I also then centering whiteness again, right? Like, do I have time for other things and other people? With friends of mine, I always hold them accountable. And if you need some time, then you can take some time and we can not have this conversation, but I'm gonna hold you accountable. But I also want to be held accountable. I am not free of privilege, right? I have educational privilege. I have American born privilege, right? I have cisgender privilege. So I need to make sure that when I'm having those conversations and I'm educating myself, right? Like I'm making sure that I'm educating myself and not just like, oh, I'm going to watch Pose and I know all about trans folks. No, I'm going to have authentic conversations. I'm going to read trans artists. I'm going to go to trans rallies. I need to be able to immerse myself in that as well. So I do that. I have conversations with people, and I usually start with all white people are racist, right? And that gets like a whoa. And I'm like, okay, but all straight people are homophobic, right? Because we have a natural reaction to when we think or see something as different or that centers our own privilege, right? So I usually start there. For me now, it's if you're not willing to read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, we can't have a deep conversation, right? And that's a place to start, not a place to finish. If we're not having authentic conversations in other places, in other ways, then I may not. Well, Tychelle, what does this look like? Girl, I'm not sure. You should read it. I heard there was a good book about it, because you really have to protect yourself in that way, especially at work, especially as a woman. More of the people in diversity jobs are men of color, right? When women are usually carrying the cultural work throughout. Right. So I have to think about that when I'm having these conversations. And when someone authentically comes to me, I want to know that you're authentically invested and not just my answer, but in the work and not being comfortable in the work as well.
Thank you so much for that response. And thank you both. This has been such an enlightening conversation. Your perspectives are so greatly and much appreciated. Thank you for your time today. To all of our viewers, I hope that you enjoyed this just as much as I have, and as I'm sure Santo has as well. And again, Lizza, Tychelle, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Santo.
Yes, and thank you, Tim, for bringing this topic to life with our guests. I really appreciate it. If you have ideas, topics that you'd like us to cover, to look at in future episodes, you can send an email to info@marabellallc.com. That's info@marabellallc.com. We'll put it up on the screen for you also. Thank you so much. This has been Dr. Santo Marabella, the Practical Prof, and BlackStory.